Okay, Daphne, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. Welcome, everyone. We have a lot of folks joining in, it looks like, and as should be, we have some AI operatives, it looks like, joining as well. So we are excited to share this with you. We have been doing a lot of work in this space, and we've got some great information to share that Joe's been working on over the past several months, and he has two great folks with him today that are going to help us unpack this study. So, for those of you who haven't met Joe Bates, who is our senior research consultant at the ACEC Research Institute, responsible for a great deal of the research that we do here. And he has joining him Emily and Jim. And Joe, I'll let you take over those introductions. Thank you all for being here. And yes, we will be making the slides and the recording available. So, Joe, over to you.
All right, thanks, Daphne, and thanks everybody for joining us today. This is a pretty popular topic, it appears to be, something that we've been very interested in working on, and I have enjoyed working on this study immensely. So, thank you all for joining us, and I'm pleased to be joined, as Daphne mentioned, by two leaders who actually participated in this research and who are approaching AI from complementary perspectives. So, just a brief introductions, and then I'm going to talk about the study for maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll come back to the panel discussion with Emily and Jim. But Emily is Director of Artificial Intelligence. That's her title, Director of Artificial Intelligence at SEH, where she leads the firm's AI strategy and implementation. So she's coming from that perspective. And then Jim Compton is the Chief Technology Officer at ESP Associates, where he oversees the technology strategy and is responsible for integration of AI across the organization. So Jim has a bit more of a tech background, at least in his title and sort of what he's done. And Emily is the new director of artificial intelligence. So both complementary perspectives here. So as I said, we'll come back to them. First, I want to talk just a little bit about the study. You all obviously will be able to access the full study. I have a QR code at the end of this presentation that you can use to download the report. The report is free to everybody, and it's meant to help the industry. So what we did this time, we took a slightly different approach than maybe has been taken in the past, and this is obviously sort of groundbreaking territory. I mean, AI is rapidly moving from sort of this idea to experimentation. Some firms are starting to use, sort of pilot projects, and we're getting to the point where we really need to understand, all right, if we're going to broaden AI implementation and really bring this across the enterprise, how can we do that with mitigating risks? There's risks associated with everything. As an engineer or working at an engineering firm, everyone understands that there's risk involved in engineering. And so we're used to thinking about risk. So what we wanted to do was take an approach that we're not trying to define every single little risk that AI poses, because we know that that's going to change. What could be a risk today might change and it won't be a risk in 2 weeks. So we tried to take a little bit of a different approach here. We wanted to ask the question, what are the risks associated with adopting AI and how can firms manage those risks? As you know, you can never eliminate risks completely, but you can mitigate them. You can take steps to manage them. And so that's what this study is all about. So just a little bit about the research. We conducted a lot of, I did a literature review, an extensive literature review to understand, well, what information was already out there and what information was missing. And truly, there's really not a lot when it comes to risks regarding AI. So we conducted 21 executive level interviews, one-on-one interviews with these 21 folks, and they were from a variety of different backgrounds. And this was on purpose. I wanted to take a 360 view of AI risk from different perspectives so that we could really understand what we are looking at here. So I talked to engineering firm leaders, I talked to public infrastructure owners, technology providers, AI consultants, legal and insurance professionals that work within the engineering industry, as well as an engineering licensure representative. So a lot of different perspectives. And I think one of the things that was really interesting was the great degree of consensus and thinking that really converged from a lot of different viewpoints. And I thought that was really remarkable. So, what I was able to produce is an AI risk framework. The idea of this framework is that you'll be able to use this, and hopefully, if I've done a good job, this framework will be durable and will be long lasting. And as new risks arise, we'll be able to place those risks within one of the areas of this framework. So, it's meant to be something that you can use as an operating paradigm going forward. And we'll see how that holds up over the next few years. This is just the first step in what we hope to be a long running study about risk. So here's the framework. There's 8 domains within this framework, and I'm just going to briefly touch on each. The full report has a lot of detail about each of these domains. And within that report, in each of these domain areas, it has questions that different people within the firm should be asking regarding the risks in that domain. So this is not just for the firm leaders. This is not just for the technology folks. And one of the key learnings from this study is that AI risk is not just about technology. It's an organizational risk. You have to take an organizational approach to AI risk. So there's 8 areas. And again, as I said, there's within each area in the full report, lots of different information for lots of different people throughout the firm, from the executive leaders to project leaders to HR and legal, and lots of information. So number 1, technical reliability and model risk. This is obviously making sure that AI is correct. This is sort of the basics, that we've got to make sure that AI, that the hallucinations don't get into final designs, that information is correct. That's what this is all about. It's about validating information before making engineering decisions. The second area is professional liability and standard of care risk. This is how firms maintain their engineering judgment. This is becoming more important, and I'll talk about that in a minute, not less important, judgment. Responsible charge, professional accountability, and compliance in the engineering standard of care. The third area is data governance, privacy, and intellectual property risk. This is how firms protect your intellectual property, your information. It's how you organize knowledge. We've talked repeatedly about data being sort of the new gold with AI, but it goes beyond that. This is about knowledge and creating and capturing that knowledge. It's not just the bits and the bytes. The next area is organizational and workforce risk. This is how firms prepare engineers to work effectively with AI while preserving mentoring, the workforce development, engineering judgment, and organizational culture. So there's a lot to be addressed within the workforce, because one of the big questions is, well, if AI starts to do things that have traditionally been done by engineers, by younger engineers, and that's what gives those younger engineers the judgment they need as they become more experienced. Well, how do we preserve that? How do we make sure that younger engineers are going to get that experience and develop the judgment they need to be senior engineers? So that's a really big area. The next is ethical, regulatory, and reputational risk. How do you maintain your standards of ethics? And so really, this talks about transparency and accountability, ethical decision-making, regulatory compliance, and maintaining the public trust. When we talked with the owners, the clients, many of them told me, I'm not really too worried about engineering firms using AI, because I expect that they're going to use it properly. They're going to let us know that they're using it. If we want to know how they're using it, they'll tell us. But we expect that the engineering firms are going to manage AI properly and use it appropriately. So that was one of the big takeaways from talking to a lot of owners. Then there's operational and cybersecurity risk. I think that one speaks for itself. It's really important when you've connected AI whether if it's from the outside, that you're protecting that information, you're making sure that you have a secure data environment. And if you have sort of a walled off area, you need to make sure that it stays protected. So that's sort of the next piece. The next one here is financial and business model risk. This is something we've talked a lot about, right? If you use AI and it takes less time to do the work, how do you manage, one, the investment in AI? How do you measure value? How do you manage the financial success of your firm? And are the business models going to change? Very likely so. So this addresses that issue. And then finally, we have strategic leadership and enterprise governance risk. These are in a particular order, and number 8 really is sort of what governs the entire organization. You have to have a strategic leadership. You have to have an approach from the top down and make sure that everybody's on the same page. And Emily and Jim will talk a lot more about that in a little bit. So this is the framework that's in the report. And there's a few other key findings that sort of come out of the research that I'm going to share quickly before we get to our panel. One is that AI risk is fundamentally an organizational challenge, not just a technology challenge. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier. So although AI discussions often focus on the software capabilities, the technical issues, the concern about quality and hallucinations, honestly, when I talked with interview participants, they acknowledged that risk, but they said that's not the real problem. I mean, it's obviously a challenge, but the real risk is, are we going to organize our company around AI properly? Are we going to govern AI properly? Are we going to have rules that we can use it in this way and not in this way? And when we do use it, this is what we have to do. So there's a lot of governance issues. And again, it makes engineering judgment more important, workforce readiness, and organizational capability. So again, what I showed you earlier about the 8 domains, they're all interconnected. You can't address risk in one area without considering risks in the other area. You have to take an organizational approach because it's all interrelated. As I mentioned earlier, engineering judgment becomes more important, not less. You have to maintain the engineer's judgment. The engineer needs to be in charge. And when I talked with folks, they always talked about sort of people first or engineer led. And I think that's really important to note. Organizational knowledge is becoming a strategic asset. This is what I was referring to earlier. It's not just about the bits and bytes. It's about the organizational knowledge. You have individuals who have a lot of knowledge, a lot of judgment, a lot of experience. How do you capture that? How do you keep that when people retire or move to other firms or decide to change careers? That is something that you have to think about how you can address, because AI needs information. It needs data. It needs that knowledge that you have to get better and to improve. AI is changing organizations, not just workflows. I think this makes a lot of sense given everything I've talked about. Again, successful AI adoption requires leadership and workforce development, mentoring, all the things that I've referred to already. And then finally, the firms making the greatest progress tend to share certain characteristics. This is at least what we learned. This is, again, a qualitative study, of course, but we found that in these interviews, executive leadership is extremely important. Having, again, the enterprise governance, not just thinking about IT, responsible experimentation, which I think a lot of firms are already doing, cross-functional collaboration. Again, you can't have silos here. You have to have everybody working together. You have to have very clear policies and continuous workforce development. That is extremely important. And then you have to have long-term strategic thinking. As I said, the risks are going to change. The specifics of these risks are going to change over time. So you have to have a strategic plan. You have to be approaching this strategically so that you can adapt and you can change as needed. All right. So now I want to get to the panel discussion, and I'm going to bring in Emily and Jim. And I'm going to actually take this screen down so you can see the full view of Emily, me, and Jim. So let me stop sharing for just a moment. And I also have to pull up my questions for the two of them. All right, so Jim, Emily, welcome. thank you for joining us today. We appreciate both your participation in the study as well as your time today. So the first area, I want to sort of take a little time and talk about each of these 8 domains and get your thoughts on each of these domains. So the first one that I want to talk about is governance, and the idea here is, where should firms begin? So one of the strongest conclusions from this research is that the greatest AI risk isn't selecting the wrong technology, well, you certainly want to get that right, but it's failing to establish effective governance before adoption of AI accelerates. You want to stay ahead of the AI adoption curve. So my first question, Emily, is for you. Since you have this role as director of AI, if an engineering firm is just beginning to think seriously about AI governance, what are the first 2 or 3 things that the leadership should do to reduce organizational risk?
I love this question. So first thing is there has to be ownership. So I was put into my role for a reason. I know other firms of other sizes might not have the ability to create a role like mine, but somebody has to own AI. Somebody has to be accountable and responsible for the governance and for the acceptable use throughout the organization. And that doesn't necessarily, sorry, Jim, need to be IT. I know AI is a technology. It's easy to say, let's just put that in the IT realm. But as you just went through all the different interconnected pillars and all the different risks associated with it, AI is a business case. It is an enterprise-wide function, and it really needs to have somebody accountable for it at the high executive level. The second thing is, I think everyone needs to understand where AI is being used within your organization and what risks already exist. You have to find those risks, you have to name them, you have to claim them. You can't govern something if you don't know what those risks are. But then once you figure out what those risks are, then you can start putting governance around it. So creating those acceptable use guidelines, creating those policies. You don't have to do it from scratch. You can use AI to create it for you, but also ACEC, AIA, there's some great policies already out there that you can tweak to your firm. But making sure that those policies are posted, visible to employees, employees are acknowledging them is so important. You got to start to contain the risk early on. And the easiest way to do that is by helping your employees understand what acceptable use looks like and doesn't look like in your firm.
One of the things that came out of the research again was education about AI, education about how to use AI. And I'm not sure I've heard a lot about that yet. So I think that's a really great point, Emily. Jim, what do you think? Do you agree with Emily, or do you have a different point of view? Obviously, you're coming from a slightly different angle here.
Uh,
But
I
what's your thought?
agree. I agree. I mean, even in the report, it says you don't want to let this be an AI governance thing with the default to the IT group. I mean, because it's not a typical software rollout. It's a change in how the organization does things. And so I think the words are used, it's a practice management decision. So it doesn't need to default to IT. Then you definitely need someone in charge of it. You need to name somebody to be in charge of it. No matter what you do, that's the first thing that needs to happen. Somebody has to own it. And if you, like Emily said, the larger firms, have more resources. Smaller firm, you may not have a lot of people, and you may write an AI policy that's 1 page instead of 50 pages, but at least something to get in front of your project managers because they're already using AI anyway. So you might as well get out there in front of them, find out what they're doing, and try to get control of it ahead of time. But yeah, definitely you need to name someone to be in charge, and it doesn't need to be IT. It needs to be more of a cross-functional team of people.
And Jim, you hit on a point that I heard repeatedly is that whether you know it or not, whether you believe it or not, people in your firm are already using AI. So you need to really get in front of that. And I talked with one person who was head of technology at their firm, and he gave a really interesting example of how you have to be really careful. They had approved various things to use when it came to AI, and so an individual had downloaded a plugin for an approved platform. Well, the plugin wasn't approved, but the person didn't know that. And the plugin started sending information from the network outside of the network without anyone knowing. And the next morning, the IT guy came in and he saw this stream because he's really on top of what's going on, and he manages that, and he's like, okay, we got to shut that down. So it's things you got to be really careful about, right?
Yeah.
The next area here, and this goes back to that, first domain is about the technical and professional risk, right? One of the report's strongest recommendations is that firms should integrate AI into existing quality management systems rather than treating it as a separate technology initiative. So again, making sure that everything that you're using AI for, the outputs are correct. So Jim, what practical controls should a firm put in place to reduce the risk that AI could influence engineering decisions without appropriate engineering review? How do you fix that?
I mean, I mean, a couple of things, but I mean, the study emphasizes that one thing we all need to remember, the responsibility does fall on the engineer and responsible charge to make sure the information is correct. So, in order to protect yourself and your company, you've got to be reviewing this stuff no matter how it was created. I mean, to me, the risk isn't that AI is going to make mistakes, because it will, but every other tool we give an engineer, they can make mistakes with too. The challenge is where the risk comes in with AI generated output is we tend to give it an undue influence over our decisions and don't apply the same professional review standards that we should. I mean, people, when you talk to people about their AI bots that they use, they tend to personalize these things, right? They have names. I personalize mine too. I do it. We talk about it. Hey, and but when you personalize it, these people talk about like they're their friend, and so they trust their friends, right? And why wouldn't they? This friend is the smartest friend they've ever had. It knows the answer to every question they ever ask it. And so they start taking the results without questioning. And so, first off, you need to try not to personalize your personal AI thing, but we all do it. But the main things I would do is, like the report says, update your QA, QC procedures to specifically state that AI generated work or AI assisted work requires the same sign offs, the same responsible charge requirements, the same documentation. I mean, you've got to draw a hard line on which activities require licensed review, regardless of how it was produced. And so, because you've got to eliminate the ambiguity for the junior staff. I mean, if they're doing work in AI, they need to know this thing needs to be reviewed so that in that manner, you can hold people accountable. If someone's, accountability is a big part of this, and so you need to have it. But you also need to communicate this information out across the enterprise. I mean, you've got to do this in different formats. You've got to do it in person. You got to do it with the email. You got to do it with newsletters. You got to do it with lunch and learns, and you got to do it with, your intranet or your hub or whatever you have, because people aren't going to hear it the first few times that it sends it out. I mean, we've even had people acknowledge the fact that they've read our AI policy because you tell them 20 times and they still don't. But it's, the legal and insurance part of this report says that the liability comes from the failure to review, not from the AI use itself. So, you have to put guidelines in place stating what has to be reviewed.
So, Emily, how do you create those safeguards without discouraging engineers from using AI productively, appropriately, and innovatively?
First of all, so Jim, mine's called my BFF Chatty, and I will keep that personalization all day long. I think the big thing is it's eliminating some of the fear around what if I'm using AI and I get caught. And I know that means something different for different people, but I loved how you just phrased that, Jim, about the standard of care is still there. The responsibility is still there. The tool is not the end game. It's how well did you review this? So putting it into your QA/QC plans, putting it into your QMPs, making sure it lives within the workflows is so important. And then making sure that people feel that they are supported as they're trying to use AI, as they're trying to get the value from it. So instead of saying you must document every place you used AI, you change the question and say, can you stand behind the work? Can you defend the work that you're putting out there? Would this hold up if you are being challenged on this work? And as long as the answer is yes, help people get the value out of AI, not run in fear from the tool itself.
I think that's great thoughts there from the both of you. And again, this idea of education, this constant need to educate your workforce, that is very important here. So the next area I want to talk about is the data and knowledge risk. So the idea here is that I talked about before is organizational knowledge, and the research repeatedly identified organizational knowledge as one of the most valuable and most overlooked assets for successful AI adoption. You can use AI before you have all the data and information you want, but it's really important to start capturing your data and organizing your data. And we have a whole other study that I'm working on about data and data connectivity. But my first question, Emily, is back to you. What should engineering firms be doing today to reduce the risks associated with poor organizational knowledge, inconsistent data, or intellectual property as AI adoption expands?
All right, I'm going to twist this one on you a little bit because I know
Sure.
it's phrased as a risk and that's the whole discussion. But I think this is such an incredibly important portion where you need to look at the opportunity that AI now brings to our firms. So what are we doing to elevate the opportunities that comes from good organizational knowledge sharing and consistent structured data and good intellectual property guardrails is kind of what I'll call it there. But our firms, especially, in our world, they're not that different. One of the biggest firm differentiators, especially for the multidisciplined, is the institutional knowledge, the project history, the lessons learned, the standards, the expertise that so often in our organizations live with one person or a small team. And as you said in the beginning, when those individuals leave, when they retire, that knowledge often loses steam. It goes with them. AI gives us the opportunity to capture that knowledge, to make sure that we're able to use that data moving forward. So it is important that you're looking at, okay, where does our data live? How are we structuring it? How can we get the most value out of it? And that has to be an intentional process. And that's really scary for a lot of firms. Our firm has been in business for 100 years. That's 100 years of institutional knowledge that exists. But if it's not in a structured way that we can use it, it's not going to have any impact on our AI strategy. And going back to the ownership, somebody has to be responsible for owning that data, for making sure it's good, for making sure the right protocols are being followed so that data is updated as maybe construction plans change or something changes in the end game. And capturing that client intelligence, all those different things are so valuable to our firms, and they're going to help us be that much more impactful in the future. But we have to be intentional about claiming it, cleaning it, and using it.
So in these interviews I conduct, I get lots of examples, lots of stories. And one example that a person provided me was they said that there was an individual who at the firm, he did a certain thing. And I forget exactly what the task was. They're like, he has been doing this for 30 years and he was going to retire. And we had to figure out how are we going to do this and capture his knowledge. Well, they created an agent and they actually named the agent after AI agent after this guy who was about to retire. And they did, they essentially recreated as best they could the task that he was performing by sort of using his knowledge to help train that agent. So really interesting story there. Jim, from your perspective and a technology perspective, what investments should firms be prioritizing?
And the first thing I would advise people to prioritize as far as an investment is the enterprise version of the AI tools. Because if the enterprise versions give you control, they have access controls in them typically that you can limit what confidential data goes out, what gets shared with the world. They also allow you to control who can spend money, who can buy extra tokens and how many. I think the public version defaults to automatically renew when you run out of tokens and you put your credit card on it. They allow you to know how many accounts you have. If you don't allow people to use personal ones and they have to use the enterprise one, then you've got a list of them, you know what they are, and all this research and people do in them, you have, even if they leave. Otherwise, you have an unknown version of private ones out there. And I've had people say to me, well, it doesn't really matter. It's only $20 a month, right? Surely they can get $20 a month worth of value out of it. I'm like, well, they can, and they'll put it on their credit card and it'll be $20 a month. And you'll find out you've got 2,000 people who did that. And you are spending $40,000 a month on data that's out of your network, it's out of your control. You don't know what they're sharing in it, and it is just completely out there. So you need to get the enterprise version of these tools and not allow people to use the personal versions, convert them over, make a process for who gets approved to have one. And so, because the cost can get crazy. Next, I would recommend that people investigate data exfiltration software. And what data exfiltration software is just what it sounds like. It's software that monitors things that are leaving your network. And it not only monitors them, but it can stop them from leaving. You can take those tools and limit what type of data can be uploaded to a browser version of a chat bot. So, you can put some protections around your data. There's several good tools out there that do that. Remember that the data governance is a business decision. It's not an IT decision, and it needs someone who's accountable for it. And then there's not a technology thing, but I would simply explain to users everything that they enter into those personal models gets shared out to the world as part of the larger models. And most people are shocked when I tell them that. They're like, what do you mean? And it changes their behavior when they realize that everything they put in there, someone else can get access to.
And those are the public models that you're talking about, not the enterprise version. Yeah.
Enterprise, you can turn that off.
Yeah. Great advice, Jim. Some very good practical steps that our audience can take. So I want to move on now to the workforce.
Joe, before we move on,
yeah,
I've got a couple of questions have come in. One, before we move off this topic, addressed to Emily, and you were talking about how to use AI and leverage it for capturing that institutional knowledge. Do you have any specific examples of maybe some ways you've done that? Is it uploading notes, meeting minutes? That seems kind of a no-brainer, but are there other things that you've done? Joe had an interesting example about the agent, right? But any other thoughts you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, actually, the example with the agent, we've done that with some of our retirees as well, but also processes. So every practice has different processes that they continually use. Each one of those processes can be talked through. So just having somebody go on a microphone and talk through, this is how I do something A to Z, capture that entire workflow and then put that into an agent, and it becomes a process that can live long after that employee has moved on to a different role or retired or anything like that. But then you can create, say, like client-specific agents that really capture the knowledge about a certain client, how they want to be talked to, how they want to be interacted with, what they typically tend to do for feedback on different designs. Looking at all the different ways that capturing that knowledge will help the full team. And then, quite honestly, looking at anything at your organization that uses Word docs, checklists, any of those things you can convert into either agents or agentic workflows. And you have to be careful of some of those workflows, because then we get into the token cost that Jim was kind of alluding to as well. But there's so many different applications, and it just comes from how are we already capturing this data? Maybe you're using Bluebeam, maybe it's comments within PDF markups, maybe it is those meeting feedbacks, or maybe it is meeting transcriptions. You're already capturing it. You might as well figure out how to use it in a way that's going to help your teammate 3 years from now.
Great. And just one follow-up, Jim, you were talking about, making sure you understand what the staff is using, that they're using the enterprise-wide versions, et cetera. But there's a question about how do you handle staff who want to use other LLMs, right, that are not part of the enterprise. some are really good at PowerPoint, some are better at, they all have their uniquenesses, right? And so are you letting people go beyond just the scope, or how do you manage through
Yeah, I
that?
mean, you can't get rid of Copilot. Microsoft is embedded in every piece of Microsoft software, so you can't get rid of that. And so people are using it for all different kinds of things. There are people we have enterprise subscriptions to Chat, GPT, and to Claude, and to some others. And so we have enterprise accounts for multiple ones of them, because some of them are better for some things than not. If you're going to do statistical analysis, you might want a Gronk account. They're all different. So we allow people to use more than one. The cost is about the same, and so it doesn't cost any more to have 3 different enterprise accounts than it does to have more of one.
And real quick, Jim, do you have an example of the data exfiltration software, a specific one?
Yeah, we have a client who will not allow us to. They will allow any of their data to leave our network, right? Even on a USB drive. So we're able to restrict data by client, and you can't stick a USB drive in a computer and copy their data onto it. It just won't do it, and so it blocks it every time. It blocks it from being uploaded to an internet site. If you tried to log on to FileZilla and send it to somewhere or send it to Dropbox, it just doesn't go.
Can you share the name of that software?
Well, there's a couple of different ones. I mean,
I think that's what they're asking for, is like, what specifically is the name of?
the one we use, we use CrowdStrike for our IT security. CrowdStrike has a piece of software called AIDR, and it's an AI monitoring and control software, and it's a data exfiltration software. So yeah, you can put all kinds of specifications there. One of the things we have in there is PII. Any document on our network that has any kind of PII data in it can't be attached to anything. So.
All right, thank you. Back to you, Joe.
All right, great questions. Please keep them coming. We'll address as many as we can. So now I want to talk about the workforce, and the interviews that I conducted. Many of the participants expressed this concern that I talked about earlier, that AI could unintentionally weaken the development of engineering judgment if firms aren't intentional about training. So Jim, I'm going to throw this one at you first. How should engineering firms develop AI skills while reducing that risk of creating engineers who are relying too heavily on AI?
So how much time do we have here?
You got 2 minutes, Jim.
That's a difficult question. Every industry is struggling with this idea. And what does it mean to rely too heavily on AI? We rely very heavily on the other software we use. We rely heavily on AutoCAD, rely heavily on Microsoft Word. So why not AI? And it's mainly because AI is different. I've never had anyone come to me with a technical question and say, oh, wait, I'm going to go ask AutoCAD what it thinks, or I'm going to go ask Microsoft Word what it thinks. They might go out and check Google, but they get so many answers that none of them carry any weight. But AI gives them an answer that's really confident in the way it delivers it. And so people tend to rely on it. And so eventually, when people are ready and have been trained and have enough judgment, you want them relying heavily on AI, because it's gonna speed up your processes. It's gonna make their designs better, but they have to use it as a tool and use engineering judgment while they're doing it. AI skills are a core professional competency. They're not going to be in the future. They are now. And so you have to develop the skills. And so you've got to develop training for the people to get the skills. Training is easy to come by. There's tons of companies that'll do it. I use Claude a lot. I'll ask Claude to create me a training manual of how to do certain features in Claude. He knows really well how to do that, and so he creates me training for it. So we have the AI bots create a lot of their own training. So it's not hard to come by. But if you're going to reduce the risk of creating engineers that rely too heavily on AI before they're ready, you've got to have a culture and the culture is going to matter more than your policies. You got to have a culture that values continuous learning and creativity, along with the expectation of quality work, and where accountability matters. I mean, if your engineers are allowed to experiment with AI, they're going to do it and they're going to learn. But if they know they're expected to create quality work, no matter what tool they use, and they'll be held accountable if they don't, they're typically going to create quality work. I mean, you still have to build engineering judgment. I mean, it's always been done in the past by people doing repetitive work that hopefully we can automate. And so, how are they going to learn it now if AI does it? Well, they're going to have to do repetitive work. They're going to have to review or check the AI work that AI is doing for them line by line for some period of time until they get competent at doing it and their supervisor allows it to become their default tool. And
So
so,
Jim, sorry, go ahead, Jim.
no, it says again, though, it falls back to the engineering responsible charge for the correctness of the data. You have to train the young engineers with some method, no matter what tool you're using.
So, Emily, Jim mentions this idea of the organizational culture, one that's focused on education, continuous learning, etc. What role should leadership play in creating that culture? How are you doing that as the director of AI?
Quite honestly, I think that culture oftentimes comes from, the top down to get infiltrated in every corner of the organization. I love that Jim used the word accountability. Creating that culture of accountability is probably the most important thing that anyone can do. Saying, this is how I'm using it, this is how I'm experimenting, this is how I'm finding new ways to use it, but also this is how I'm accountable to the back end and what's being produced. Making sure that people have faith that when they can experiment, that they're okay being wrong in their experiments, that it's okay to fumble as we all do when we're learning new skills. I look at AI as a skill more than a tool, and saying, you know what, that's okay. Let's share the wins. Let's share the what comes from the curiosity. I think that's a big missing part of workforce development is cultivating curiosity within the organization, because curiosity is going to say, I'm going to fact check the output. I'm going to try new things. I'm going to tweak the way I've always done something in a way that allows for AI within that workflow. So cultivating that culture of accountability and curiosity and making sure that you're being loud and vocal about what you're doing yourself. People will hide in the shadows and they'll look at those shadow tools. They'll look at those, we're not going to see any value from an individual's work case. We're going to see value when that's put out through the entire workflow or through the entire team. So having that kind of loud and proud of, this is where I'm at, this is how I'm using it, and making sure that people feel safe to be just as vocal about their use cases so that somebody else can learn from them. The best cases that I've seen within our company is when you're sitting at the beginning of a meeting and they kick off by saying, how did you use AI this past week? And people will put out the most unique use cases, and you'll have everyone else in the room going, I didn't know you could do that. But it takes somebody to stand up and say, tell me how you're using it, and not in a way that looks like I'm reprimanding you for using it, but in a way that says, I'm going to celebrate your experimentation, whether it worked or not.
Yeah, so this idea of experimentation is sort of the next thing I want to drill down on a little bit. Balancing innovation and creativity with risk management. One of the themes of this report was that we need to encourage experimentation without allowing AI use to become fragmented or unmanaged. So you brought up some really good points there, Emily. Jim, from your perspective, how can firms reduce that risk while still creating a culture that encourages innovation and learning?
I mean, the biggest problem we have is people are experimenting and learning. They're just doing it with their own tools. And so you've got all this shadow AI going on out there, people using it and putting your data in it. So we need to get approved platforms out there for people to use so they're experimenting on the right stuff. But like I said earlier, investing in those enterprise tools, you talk about AI, talk about, how it's being used, like Emily said, in meetings, help create that culture that people are talking about it, sharing information. If somebody brings up in that meeting something they did and you're in charge of that meeting and you're like, I wouldn't have done that, but maybe we can talk about that later, but it's still, you have the freedom to bring it up. One of the things that we've done, we created an AI governance team. So you've got the one person that you've assigned to be in charge of AI in your company. And your team may only be 2 or 3 people, but that one person you've assigned to be in charge leads that team. And that team needs to include some leadership. It needs to include somebody from IT and engineering, and they oversee everything IT. I'm assuming Emily's company, she's that person that does that. She's the director. And so, they're going to be able to see what people are doing. If what they're doing is cost effective, is the return on the investment? Did they spend 20 hours to automate a process that takes an hour? Or did they spend 5 hours to automate a process that you do every week for 10 hours? There's big return differences. And so you got to find out if they're cost effective, and you've got to be able to share that information with all the other groups. And so it's not, if somebody's going to create a complicated piece of software, write some code, like Emily said, you've got to have documentation of how it was created, how you can fix it, because you're going to get an update to the software it's linked to, and it's going to quit working, and you're going to be stuck if people are relying on it. So you got to know how to fix it. So yeah, I would create a group that oversees AI, that can take the request and can help provide feedback and encourage people to get involved with that group. We also have a sort of a chat room where people can get on there and put their ideas on and talk about AI.
So, yeah, that's a really good point. And Emily, I'm going to go slightly off script here, but I'm confident you can handle the question. So, Director of Artificial Intelligence, that's, as I recall, that's a new position at SEH, correct?
Yep.
And so, how does that work? Are you the one that is ultimately responsible, or is this do you have a team? How has SEH structured this?
So, this is a very new position. So just putting that caveat out there, but it is, one of the first things I did was I took the time to create an overall risk matrix tying AI to the different components of the company. And within that risk matrix, there's the risk, there's how to mitigate it, but there's a risk owner. So I'm working on formalizing a team for governance, because after hearing Jim talking about that early on, I do feel that that's super important. I would add to your list of people, Jim, that it needs to include somebody from HR, because that workforce development, that workforce planning is so critical to the success of AI. But then going back to the risk matrix, naming out, I think I have almost 30 risks identified, naming out the owners and saying, are you comfortable owning this risk? And hopefully the answer is yes for every one of those. Otherwise, there's a big gap at the company. But having the experts in their field owning the risk for their territory that they typically are involved in, I think is critical, because one person can't own AI at a firm. One person needs to be in charge of leading it and trying to get people to push the rock uphill and to put the right pieces in place that says we have the governance, we know the risk, we know the tools, we know the responsible use, but then making sure that the experts in their area are also helping to shoulder the effort, because it is organizational wide, it is enterprise wide. No firm is going to succeed unless everybody gets on board.
Great. So Daphne, I'm going to pause for a second here. I've got plenty more questions, but I want to make sure we address some of the audience questions as well.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll just share a comment, which is was sent in, to talk about the shadow technology. And their comment was that, some of these very large firms are slow to adopt new technology. And so maybe their employees are in the right in leaning into shadow technology to combat that inertia. So just a point of view being shared.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
I would say this is where it's super important to make sure everyone understands the governance, the acceptable use, because there's so many tools and you want to encourage people to try them out and to experiment with them, but also having that list of, I can put my private information into this tool, I can put my confidential information into this tool, this one I can't, but for this one-off use case, I can experiment with it. And I know, Jim, that's different than what you're going to. And I do think that enterprise agreements is so critical, but I also think that comes from the just making sure people understand what is acceptable and what isn't is the absolute baseline that every firm needs to get to.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, there are firms who don't want to adopt it. And if you're in an engineering role or any kind of role in a firm today and you aren't learning how to use AI, you know you're getting behind. And so you're going to have to go out and get your own subscription. I mean, I had my own subscription for a year or so before we ever got the corporate versions. And so knowing what you can and can't put in there is what's critical. You don't want someone with a personal version saying, "Oh, I need to sort everybody's social security number by the city they live in," is so, but people getting their own shadow version and experiment and learning, I think that learning is critical.
Back to you, Joe.
Okay, great. Again, thanks for those questions. So I want to go back to one of the other points in the report, which is that perhaps one of the bigger risks is not adopting AI, it's failing to prepare the organization for changes that AI will bring. So it kind of dovetails nicely into this idea of, well, there are firms that don't want to adopt AI, but maybe the bigger risk is failing to prepare the organization for these changes. So Emily, looking ahead 3-5 years, what should firms be doing now to begin making and reducing the long-term strategic risks?
I think this answer is going to be different for every firm because everybody's at a different place in their journey. I mean, there's some that have their data in so many unstructured buckets that you're going, okay, you need to really spend some time getting your data put together so you can use it for the next, 3 to 5 years and beyond. There's others that are going to say, I'm not even allowing my people to use AI, so therefore I need to at least start. And what does that look like in 3 to 5 years? But I think for me personally, I feel like the one big caveat is that we have to come up with that workforce development plan that says, how are we going to ensure that our people are getting the skills that they need, that they're being upskilled, that we're not going to end up 5 to 10 years out where we have engineers who missed out on that human mentoring, that in the field experience, and they weren't given the same opportunities as engineers who are already 5 to 10 years into their career. And all of a sudden they're put in project management positions or client service positions, and they don't know exactly how to defend their process or defend their work. So putting that time, you really have to identify what risk is the biggest one to your individual firm. But I think the underlying tone has to be, what do I need to do today to prepare my people for the firm that we are going to be in 3 to 5 years, and letting that be the thread. And that falls into the, how are my people going to be using the data, not just where does the data live? How are my people going to be mentoring the next generation, not just where does that mentoring or learning and development exist? And what are our clients going to expect from us in 3 to 5 years? And how do we start shifting the conversation around the value that our clients expect to get from AI that we're using in our firms? That's something we haven't necessarily touched on yet, but that's a big thing, is client expectations. So wrapping your entire next 3 to 5 years around your people is going to be, I think, the most critically important element.
Jim, where do you think firms are most vulnerable if they delay making investments in AI and making investments in preparing the organization to use AI?
I mean, to me, the most of the damage is in your workforce and in your data gathering and clarifying your data. I mean, not the technology. If you decide to catch up one day, you can buy the technology and the tools, but you can't catch up on the 5 years worth of undocumented institutional knowledge that you could have gotten during that time. And then someone walks out the door. You can't recover from a group of engineers who were the younger engineers who were never mentored and taught how to develop that engineering judgment, because it wasn't an official AI thing that you were doing. And so now you've got this whole group of engineers that really don't have that much engineering judgment, or you're not able to recruit new talent because they know your firm is not really doing anything with AI. And so they're not going to want to come there. So your firm is going to slowly decline because you aren't keeping up with the pace. And so those slow building risks like that don't show up on the P&L until it's too late. And firms, Emily just touched on it. Firms, they're not going to be able to compete on responsiveness. Clients are going to start expecting the speed and insight that AI gives people, and they aren't going to be able to deliver that. So, I mean, something the report called out, and one of the large firms said many firms appear to be driven by fear that they're falling behind competitors rather than a thoughtful evaluation of where AI creates meaningful business value. I mean, that's its own kind of delay risk. Firms adopting, reactively out of fear. I mean, they end up with the same fragmentation, the same governance problems, and everything else as someone who waited. And so neither one of those are good options.
Yeah. Daphne, is there a good question from the audience that you'd like to
Yeah,
ask?
I would like to ask this one because I think you all know that, the vast majority of ACEC members are small firms, right? 50 or less employees. And so one of the questions is related to smaller firms. And what would what are your thoughts on a best practice for smaller firms? Obviously, they don't have the same resources available to them that larger firms do, especially in relation to the ownership of the risk. Where should that sit? How does a small firm manage that?
Emily?
It's interesting. I actually had a talk with a client this morning who said, I just want to learn a little bit more. We have 6 people. And he said, how do I make sure people are using it responsibly and managing it? And it's like your answer is right there. The answer is the leadership owns the AI risk, it owns the AI governance. And as much as you want to have different pillars, sometimes you just have to start somewhere. And as I mentioned in the beginning, there's so many free resources that are vetted and approved through ACEC, AIA that can already have these frameworks available. And I'll put a plug in for the entire report. There's so many great things that even if you don't have a director of human resources or a chief information officer, you can kind of identify and visualize who at the firm typically plays this role, and then say, okay, this is how we're going to come together as a firm to make sure we're getting the most value while staying safe and making sure we have the right standard of care when it comes to AI use in our designs. But just saying we're too small, nobody's going to own this is not going to be the way forward. Somebody's got to raise their hand. And if nobody's going to raise their hand, it's going to be a really difficult uphill battle.
Yep. All right, Jim, you got 30 seconds. What's your thoughts for the small firms? So we could do a whole other webinar on this.
We could. I mean, I've been in several small firms. I would assume that there is an owner of that small firm, and that person would be highly concerned about the risk that's being taken on by people using AI without some kind of guidance. And so I would get the guidance, put it in place. Like I said, even if it's only a couple of pages, you need to keep up with what people are doing. If there's only 9 or 10 people, you could talk to them on a regular basis and find out what's happening. You want to get them trained on it. I mean, if they can double the speed of what they're doing, and that's a huge advantage for you because now, you've got more people doing more work. So I would say, yeah, you don't have all the staff, you don't have all the software, but you can get people to use common sense and not upload crazy things and to learn how to use it to make them faster.
And one of the things I'll add is that in my research, it's very clear that the idea that smaller firms can be more nimble and can move more quickly and can change direction more quickly because you are smaller. So that is another advantage that a smaller firm has, even if you don't have all of the resources that a larger firm might have. All right, well, thank you, Emily and Jim. We are out of time. I wish we had more time to talk about this topic, but thank you so much. And I'm going to throw it back to Daphne.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Great conversation. I do want to give a big shout out to our contributors at the ACEC Research Institute. Without them, we would not be able to bring you this research. So if you're not on this list and you'd like to be, please reach out to me. We'd love to have you join our family. Jim, Emily, thank you so much for your participation, for sharing your thoughts. I'm sure you'll probably get some emails after this of folks reaching out to you. Joe, great work as always on the research. And here's how to download the full report. It's also on our website. We will be sending you a link to that along with the presentation recording later today or early tomorrow, depending on how long it takes to download. And just want to thank you all for being with us. Thank you for your support of the ACEC Research Institute. and I hope you stay well. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you all.